Nice. Potent shit.
Yeah, you chose a good one.
Oh, everything's. Oh, man. All right. Now maybe we can get started here.
I think so. All right. I think we're going to be looking good here. Take. We're good. All right. Take one. Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is Nate Winokur, VP founder of Bell Costa Labs, as well as one of the founders and creative director of Teaching Bud, the education company that is bringing you today's podcast, which is specifically going to be on Aspergillus mold. It's a bit of a hot topic right now where we're at in California, and myself and Boomer have come to put some things into context, explain a few things, and even talk about what happens if you happen to see this pop up in your own operation. Boomer, thank you so much for joining me, brother.
Thank you, Nate, for having me again. It's always a pleasure, and I'm stoked to be on here, guys. Hello, I am Brian Boomer. My company is Booms Farm. You can find me on Instagram at Booms Farm. And we're working today with the Teaching Bud group as we have been. And you can find us on Instagram at Teaching Bud for you, if I remember correctly. And we're going to be posting a lot more here on YouTube and Instagram and other social handles. But the topic today is relevant for cultivators, processors, and consumers alike. The words you said, Aspergillus?
Aspergillus. We're talking about a type of mold that occurs worldwide. There are about, in this family, or genus, there are about 180 different species, and 4 of those species are on the California panel, as well as many other panels that you'd see for the microbial part of the analysis. Now, the microbial part of the analysis looks for mold and bacteria, but in the case of California, all of the mold is looking for one of those 4 different species. All of the tests rather are looking for those 4 species of Aspergillus amongst a couple of different types of bacteria.
Now, you say 4 out of 180. Was there health concerns and risks with those 4? Why just those 4?
Now, if I understand everything correctly, and this gets into a part of the biology of Aspergillus and what you are dealing with in terms of that microorganism and why you'd want to stay away from it and stuff like that. If I'm not mistaken, we're looking specifically at mold-based toxins, and these 4 species being the most prevalent in terms of producing these mold-based toxins called mycotoxins. And it's worth mentioning that there are types of mycotoxins that are studied on the California as well as other states panels as well. But there are a number of different mycotoxins in the aflatoxin and ochratoxin categories, if I recall correctly, that are going to be covering what types of toxins are known to come from certain types of molds, including Aspergillus and including, if I'm not mistaken, the species that are on the California panel.
Got it. And I've heard of this as a grower too, but I didn't really understand it's a mycotoxin. So what you're talking about is something that can hurt you? I mean, what do you mean by mycotoxin? What does it do to you if you consume it?
So myco, like mycology, it's a mold-based thing.
Okay.
It's a mold-based toxin is what a mycotoxin
Got
is
it.
basically
Okay.
saying. So can toxins hurt you? Yes, that's the nature of, what we're talking about when we talk about a toxin or something toxic to human physiology. And the idea of it being part of the safety panel is that the regulatory body who put it there is trying to keep that particular type of toxin away from the consumer.
And that makes sense when I've been, growing in the past, and we had discussions a long time ago when I first failed for Aspergillus was actually on keef that I had sifted and didn't realize I didn't let it dry and cure. And I took it to you guys and I failed. And you had educated me on Aspergillus, and I didn't realize that it typically is due to moisture or water content, maybe in the product that's left, because we talked about that it's in the environment, so it's in the grow already, but it was more so when I harvest the flower or the trichomes that post production, I didn't do it right. And maybe that's what led to that.
You've got it where it's like, think of it almost like mold friendly conditions.
It's wet.
You know,
It's wet and dark,
that's
yeah, environment. The dry
yeah.
room is,
It is, a humid and wet environment, and the product itself is wet.
right.
And think of the conditions that would allow a piece of bread to get moldy versus not, and those conditions are mold friendly
Yeah,
conditions.
mold's not growing in dry, hot weather. It's going to be in the cold, damp, dark
It,
places,
usually damp, darkness
Oh,
often
warm.
will
I guess it'd
be,
be warm, yeah, too, but
you're on point,
wet. Yeah,
It's those perpetually damp, warm,
right.
wet environments that are going to be pro mold, and not just Aspergillus will be found there, but anything potentially, it's pro mold condition. So
Yeah, like
multiple grow,
powdery mildew for us is prevalent in
even though
humidity.
that's not actually part of the testing panel itself, and we'll get into that a little bit later.
Right.
You could suggest that it could be like an indicator mold of some other bad news that could be just around the corner.
That makes sense. And I did touch on this too, but where are you usually seeing Aspergillus like triggered? Like if you were to test it in the baby plant stage, mature, post harvest, or packaged, like where would you usually see it pop up?
It shows up mostly in the post harvest stages.
Okay.
Um, I'd want to go into a good amount of detail that almost in itself will be its own like education piece or podcast. But typically in the later stages, typically in areas of shared infrastructure is where you're going to run into that kind of thing.
What do you mean shared infrastructure? Like the grow room itself, the dry room, the building?
One could suggest the veg space, although
Mhm.
I don't generally see Aspergillus growing or thriving in the grow space unless part of the building is compromised. There's some kind of water damage, oftentimes when it does come through
Okay.
through that root cause. Water damage is often, at the very base of that. And in that sense, it could potentially come from a grow room. More often than not, the grow rooms aren't the origin, or the veg aren't the origination point of where it comes from. It comes from other parts of the facility that are shared.
Mm,
Shared infrastructure includes hallways, trim, dry areas,
I can see that.
packaging areas, and so forth.
Well, I appreciate that because it makes a lot of sense as we've talked about that in the past. And, I guess moving forward, some of the growers, you guys may not be understanding what it takes to be a licensed operator and do compliant testing. And we are discussing that. So, enlightening you a little bit of what you would be looking at buying from, say, a dispensary. The whole point of the compliance model is to protect the consumer against, these hazardous, pesticides, molds, contaminants, and, monitoring for standardization, if you will. And here in California, we have the DCC, which is the Department of Cannabis Control. And what they're doing is working with laboratories that like Bell Costa Labs and the cultivators, the manufacturers that do extraction or the distribution and dispensaries, all to have a standard across the board for, the testing, packaging, and the sales of these products. And if they find something outside of what is allowed, they will pull a recall. And by doing this, they're going into the dispensaries, the distros, the cultivation sites, and they're doing these audits, usually, which involve testing the material themselves
Mhm.
through their labs and through their measures. And they will tell you if you're passing or not. Labs like yours offer two types of testing that growers may not know of. It's called R&D and compliance testing. Most cultivators, we will do what's called R&D prior with the lab, where we're not required by the state. We're just doing it to research and develop if we are using proper practices. If we find that we're not using the right practices, this is the time for the lab to help us stop and re-evaluate our plan before we put mass amounts of product into the market, because it won't pass a compliance test. A compliance test is when a cultivator has to have their whole entire harvest tested on their facility by a third party lab that comes in under video camera, and they're documenting randomized sampling of all the flower from this strain batch that was grown. They then will go and test it as a third party for multiple things that we'll go ahead and talk about. One of them being Aspergillus, to make sure that this batch is safe for public consumption. If it passes, that batch can now be put into the market. This is where things, I guess, get a little touchy. And I wanted to talk to you about maybe the nuances and why we're seeing cultivators sometimes do lab testing that may or may not pass, but get tested by the DCC and fail. And then they have an entire batch. It could be 100 pounds destroyed essentially and recalled off the shelves. And this goes on for other things like pesticides. So I want to talk about what is the standardization and the scrutiny that the labs have to go through, as well as the cultivators and manufacturers that are in that supply chain.
I appreciate you bringing about some of those things, man. Yeah, that's a really good set of prompts to what I was thinking next, which is really the questions of what are you looking at? What are we testing? How does that work? In terms of let's start with this. How does a lab test this kind of stuff? A lab comes in and tests 0.35% of a batch. So the batches for at least flower in California can be up to 50 pounds. So when you mention a 100-pound batch, oftentimes you'll see that, something like that split into two 50-pound
Yeah,
batches if it literally works out to just those
100.
exact
Yeah.
numbers. But there's a couple of things to consider in terms of how the sampling is happening and what gets picked up. Number one, assuming flour, we're picking up 0.35% of the batch. That's not very much. One third of 1% of the batch gets sampled. 90, 99.65% of the batch does not get touched. And so there are a couple of things to sort of start considering here in terms of how these numbers start working out. Not only is there a very random nature to mold and how it shows up and where it shows up and whether or not this spore happens to be in a particular sample, but bear in mind that we're only taking a sample of one third of 1% of the batch.
I was gonna say that's next to nothing, man. I'm running some numbers right here, and you're talking about grams.
And yeah, just to give you an idea of how much that is. It means for every 10 pounds of
Yeah,
that the batch itself actually is, there's 16 grams that we'll be taking for every 10 pounds. You do that same proportion in math all the way up to 50 pounds, and you take 80 grams. So you end up taking about 3 ounces, right? If you think about it,
yeah,
yeah,
to
you end up
represent pounds of
to
production.
you take about 3 ounces to represent 50 pounds.
Okay.
And this really does kind of give you an idea that if there's any level of detection that might be available in another part of the batch, you don't oftentimes see the get a very good snapshot of what that entire batch has, either
Mhm.
contamination wise, sometimes even potency wise, and things like that, when you only take one third of 1%. There's a lot of things that can happen, but the idea is that this is the standardization for things.
Hmm.
And that standardization was spelled out by the state, in the case of California, by the DCC. And that standardization, whether or not it is good enough or whether or not it is already too much, is up to say what the idea in terms of the consumers, have of
Mhm.
testing and what level of assurance they get from testing. It also has to say with the level of oversight that the DCC exercises in terms of these things. Let's just say, as somebody had suggested to me, that the DCC, rather than taking one third of 1%, and from even that one third of 1%, only testing a very small cross section, really only about a gram of the actual batch gets tested for micro at the end
Mm.
of it. If you think about what, actually goes up into a testing sample.
Interesting.
Yep. And so there's, been a little bit of leaked information that says the state takes and tests up to 25 times that size for the sample,
Uh,
which would be a gross lack of standardization in terms of how a testing lab does it. Bear in mind, a testing lab with a fairly small batch, say something about 10 pounds to even 20 pounds, based on that based on the math, you're only taking 16 to 32 grams. You have no ability to utilize 25 grams for a single sample.
Hmm.
That's outrageous. So that's something to bear in mind as, we do kind of dissect this whole thing and look at it. Now, if we go back to the likelihood that somebody's going to find the one bit of mold in a whole operation, I kind of liken that to, and you've heard me use this example before. Imagine you have your bread factory, and let's say there's one piece of moldy bread in
Right.
that whole factory, right? What is the likelihood? Let's say there's 5 million slices of bread in that factory. What's the likelihood somebody's going to find that one moldy slice? But the way that things go is once contamination is there, that might point to something larger. And if in this quick, fun example that ends up being the case, let's say this, that you have now not just one moldy slice, let's say a third of the slices in that factory, in that bread factory, are now
Yeah.
moldy. Is somebody going to pick up on that? Yeah, really fucking
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah.
And so it's the notion of what do you have to have in there that actually brings up the question of is this place contaminated? And if something's being found, what is the understanding of what it means to actually have a level of widespread concerning contamination, which can be picked up by testing and is a very important thing to be aware of, versus a random slice of moldy bread, which is kind of a thing for virtually any type of production environment. And cannabis is no, it is, cannabis is not excused from that same type of
Mhm.
that same type of behavior. So that's just an idea in terms of how sampling works and what kind of cross section you might get. This also doesn't necessarily mean that the nature of how here in California the DCC tests things is the right way to go because it's done on it's a zero tolerance kind of approach. Basically, if Aspergillus is there, any amount, and if we can prove that it's viable, if it's a living sample, even knowing that it might be in one part of the batch and not another, or it might be in this handful but not another handful, like, isn't that concern enough to say, is this the right approach? Again, you can tell if it's something worth concern if it shows up in every single sample over and over again. We have
Mhm.
a real contamination issue. But if it's something that shows up once every so often, is this really the kind of thing that should be a standard for failure of a batch? Or if the testing lab happens to take in their third of 1% a sample that doesn't actually see Aspergillus, in the case of what even my lab has seen, is that fair to be able to say that the lab actually overlooked something that had to do with the health and safety of that batch? Or is the likelihood even greater than that happening, that there was just a part of the batch that did have a level of contamination in it and other parts that didn't? Because last meal you had, we absolutely had a dynamic where one bite of food, real talk, you one bite of your dinner had Aspergillus in it, the next bite of your dinner did not.
You bring up a couple good points, and I think looking back at this too is the standardization has been something that we've all been kind of learning as we go too, and this sounds like something that you guys have also seen challenges with, maybe nuances in the testing sector. And I'm only basically understanding in how you guys test things like with a PCR for Aspergillus, and there's some other methods that you guys do, but can you maybe go over a little bit of that as we kind of dive more into that process of understanding how you even test for it? Because you can't see it, right? You don't really see it visually.
No, you don't generally see it. You do utilize a PCR, qPCR. So the same type of instrument you would generally see used to match genetic or other types of evidence that's specific on the genetic level. You utilize a PCR so that in this case, you're not only able to see Aspergillus, but you're able to speciate it. You can go pretty far in
Mm,
terms of being
okay.
able to see what's there, what you're dealing with, and so forth. Now, with Aspergillus, you have Bell Costa Labs, most of the industry utilizing a kit being a combination of reagents and other consumable tools, and just generally things you need to use in order to test speciate and so forth with Aspergillus and other microorganisms. We use a kit from a company called Medicinal Genomics. This is one of their specialties is
Hmm.
building these kits for cannabis companies to be able to test these things. Through a little bit of the deep dives that have come from certain challenges that have been presented by the state recently, it's come to light that their method, they utilize a thing called a kit from a company called Thermo Fisher, which in general is a fine company, but you don't see them very frequently in cannabis. In fact, in cannabis, they generally don't sell to cannabis companies.
Hmm.
And because of that, there's no cannabis labs really, as far as I know, countrywide, maybe worldwide. There are precious, precious few who maybe have gotten their hands on old equipment or something. But at the very least, you can suggest that this is a type of product manufacturer whose testing of products in cannabis has very little to no field experience evidence behind it.
Hmm.
And the Thermo Fisher kit is who the state in this case decided to utilize, which really brings, you mentioned
Hmm.
standardization, and this really brings certain things into question when you start to talk about standardization. Because if, the regulatory body isn't using a technology that the labs themselves have access to,
Yeah.
politely, but what the fuck are we doing? Like, that's not fair. That's not standardized. Anything could happen, right? If you're using this technology that one does not have a hell of a lot of use in the industry already, it's the prone to difficulty, to inaccuracy. That's a concern. And then, what is the state doing? Because I can tell you from personal experience, they'll utilize, these ideas, these lacks of standardization, as if they were standardized. And they'll make claims as if to suggest that things are on an even playing field, but it doesn't really feel like that. And if you're using something that nobody else has access to, could you imagine in the analogy of a playing field, there's one athlete that gets to make all the rules, and by the way, they're the one who gets to use steroids,
Yeah.
and by the way, they're the one who gets to compare what they can perform to everybody else. And no, that's not fair, and that's not the even playing field that we're talking about. So when it comes to standardization, I can speak very, very straightforwardly for California and let you know between what I've heard and then what parts of the method the state themselves have actually published. Not very good job at standardizing when it comes down to the enforcers versus the people that they're supposed to be looking after. It makes people concerned. I can again speak for from personal experience when I can say seeing the inconsistent enforcement and things that are sort of just seemingly figured out on the spot. I can see the damage that stuff like that has wrought. It's not a terribly fun thing to be dealing with. So, yeah, standardization is big, man. Thank you for bringing that up.
No, I did have another question because I'm listening to this as a third party, and I've watched some of this, develop here in California with the compliance and regulatory inconsistencies is at the best. But from an outsider perspective, if you're a lab who has ISO accreditation and you guys are going off of an SOP that was developed for laboratories that the DCC did come in and inspect and said, this is approved for you guys to be running your processes, but that nuance, what you're saying is that you're running a kit that's different than they're running, they may or may not have recognized that, and thus they get different results when they do their inspections, is what I'm understanding. It sounds like it's not apples to apples, is what I'm seeing.
You can say that anything might be happening when there's a lack of standardization. It's almost notable when you have
Hmm.
two methods that are not standardized with one another that arrive at the same answer.
Hmm.
That's a neat thing to have happen,
Hmm.
but that's not really the name of the game when it comes to regulation.
Right.
We're not in some experimental research phase to see if we can orthogonally validate a method through, through testing through a completely separate method. Um, that no, that nature is, we escape from that when we come to standardization. It's really up to any regulatory or enforcement body to be doing so based on the same playing field, if you will,
Right.
that anybody who's being enforced upon is deciding to play. The notion that, again, in the playing field, that one person isn't playing by the same rules as everyone else should be glaringly obvious when it is. And unfortunately, in this case, there doesn't seem to be, between what we know and what we've heard, there doesn't seem to be much interest in having created
Yeah.
that even sort of fairness in the first place.
Yeah, or communicate the concern, more so. But, I guess one of the things we can talk about is what is the impact on the cannabis industry? Because this is, from your experience, one lab, but also from a cultivator side is, we've been seeing some inconsistencies and challenges from tax to what you can and can't use in certain counties just for pesticides alone. And then we're all based off of a state guidelines for testing. So Aspergillus, circling back on that, just because it seems to be plaguing not just California, but a lot of cannabis operators, period, is in
Mhm.
the industry, with regulatory entities all over the place. But what do you see in terms of real world effects, terms of how is Aspergillus affecting crops? And, what are the labs needing to do just besides testing? Like, if I'm a grower and I'm testing with you for Aspergillus, what's the next step?
It's been a pretty big impact. No, good questions. Um, so first area of that I'd want to highlight, we have a potential of good batches, and this is just based on the information we've brought to light already. This is
Right.
something that occurs worldwide. This is something that is on something of a zero tolerance kind of format. And you can have good batches that are seemingly 99% spore and mold free,
Hmm.
potentially fail because this is something random that can happen. Like, you have, a left and a right working hand. Fortunately, your
Right.
left hand has Aspergillus, your right hand doesn't.
Right.
What do you do with that information? You know what I mean? If it's in one place and not another, that could change from point to point, from day to
Hmm.
day. It really does mean that you can have a risk of good product coming from a good place
Hmm.
ultimately failing. And I think most, from what I've seen, or from just talking to people, most growers in this industry either have themselves or have known somebody who have just had seemingly failed out of nowhere.
Hmm.
You hear it's Aspergillus, and you're like, oh, well, it's a question of whether or not it should be there. It's a question of fairness. It's a question
Hmm.
of if we're approaching this the right way.
Hmm.
It's not a question of does a random spore show up every so often,
Right. Right. Did they get the
Now,
the needle in the haystack? Is what they found. Yeah.
there is, as crazy as it is to be, speaking against the need to test for Aspergillus, it ends up being a big need when you get down to a full-blown contamination in a facility. I've gotten to the point in facilities where I've helped them with testing, and something like a third of the samples I test will test for not only Aspergillus, but the same strain. Like, there's
Hmm.
less of a question that
That's a
a
lot more
spore
obvious.
floated
Yeah.
in, and it's a much more straightforward indication that there's actually an issue going on with the facility.
Hmm.
I'm at a good place to be able to determine this through working in root cause analysis.
Hmm.
And so when this has happened, oftentimes it's testing for a company and seeing something, show that it's a systemic issue, say in a certain facility, in a certain
Right.
operation. I have the opportunity to go in, run a root cause analysis search, and find out which part of the operation is rotten
Hmm.
so that ultimately could be cut out and, fresh infrastructure be introduced that won't broadcast harmful spores.
Hmm.
So there is a need for testing. There
Yeah.
is a need for being able to catch this. Bringing this to light is something that was done properly. that happened with regulation. Because if somebody did have a seriously infested operation, well, they need to know about it. We need to know about it.
Right.
Everything needs to point towards it being fixed
Right.
and it being able to receive the help it needs so that that operation can get well again and continue pumping out what it
Hmm.
needs to be pumping out, right? What we end up with instead is an unfortunate impact on the industry with the hit and miss nature of how things have been enforced. And not all labs have been enforced on. There actually are some bad actor labs who have bent
Hmm.
rules for certain large scale clients.
So it's like, hey man, I failed. Can you help me out?
Well, if anything, the data regarding the fail is suppressed
Mm.
and it doesn't get uploaded to the state. It's any data because you need data showing that, hey, I found this organism
Right.
here.
Right.
That data suppressed. In other words, nothing found. There's no smoke. There's no fire. I
Mm.
guess, print it, right? It's ready to go.
Yeah.
Now, this has been a tactic that I've witnessed multiple times over, where certain large-scale companies who know they have an issue are more than happy to find a willing laboratory who will simply tell them that they don't have an issue.
Mm.
I've lost as a lab more business than I can possibly tell you uh, by not telling people what they want to hear.
Because
It's
they
a
don't want to
serious.
fix the core problem. They'd rather just,
It can cost millions of dollars to
yeah.
fix the core problem and quite a bit of time. That's not always the case. And I would argue that somebody should
Right.
want to know if there's an issue for the sake of being able to fix it.
Right.
But this has been based on hit and miss enforcement
Mm.
and not all labs being treated equally. This is an effect that the regulators have essentially wrought out from the industry is people trying to squirrel things away.
Mm.
Science is being used as a hit and miss tool, and you end up looking for those that deliberately miss in order to increase their position in the market because maybe companies wouldn't be coming to them if they told others that
Mm.
they failed. There's weirdly a pretty big market in California, and there has been for years, of for a laboratory who just simply tells people and prints on paper for people what they want to hear. No,
Wow.
you don't have this contamination. Yes, your THC is this high, right?
Yeah, the THC
Um,
shopping. Yep. The
it's
labs. Yeah.
this is really at the root of these systemic issues
Hmm.
that are plaguing that are plaguing the cannabis industry and the companies therein,
Right.
with how they feel they need to respond to a lot of these difficulties that exist. It really is a thing to behold.
Thinking about what you're saying, and as a cultivator, I think about the challenges being the grower that thinks that, well, if I put this product into the market and it fails, I risk it getting recalled. That's a lot of money and brand reputation, right? Do you think that DCC is confusing presence with contamination overall, and maybe it's not a fair assessment? Or how do you guys really feel? Like, I get it, if the majority or a good portion of the batches are infected, I, as a consumer, want to know that and be safe from that. But does like a little bit actually mean that whole batch is trash?
I think that this needs to be a topic of conversation, really. Do I think that this Boolean approach is a species, one of these four species of Aspergillus, present? If the answer is yes, then it fails. And we can go take it a step further and say, is it present and viable? And if the answer
Mm.
is yes, it fails. Just to anybody who has heard me use that term viability or viable a couple of times, what my lab does is we go a step further or a couple of steps further, and what's been an approved method up until recent times. We've gone through steps that not only show if Aspergillus is present, but also look to see if it's alive. It gets plated,
Mm.
and from being plated, it gets incubated. If anything does in fact grow, we recheck it. We
On like a
confirm
culture dish is what you're doing. You're
exactly.
growing on a
Yeah,
dish. Yeah.
we were
Okay.
in plating. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I just
The
want to make sure I'm
equivalent
understanding.
of like a petri dish,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. There you go.
We're going to be looking to see if what has actually grown is in fact Aspergillus.
The species too.
And one of the four
Gotcha.
species that, would cause a fail. If yes, it's alive. If yes, it's Aspergillus, then, of course, that's something that we've taken as far as we can as a testing lab in terms
Hmm.
of testing and looking to see if what we've DNA matched is in fact live or dead DNA. And if it is alive, and if it could therefore be potentially harmful, and therefore it fails. Now, viability testing is an interesting way to go because dead DNA is not something you technically need to worry about.
Hmm.
And we were able to see an improvement in being able to determine how concerning a finding of Aspergillus was upon introducing years and years ago now viability testing. And from
Hmm.
what I understand, most states do this, and even though most labs in most states do this.
Hmm.
And from what I've been told, even in California, although they use methods that aren't available to the labs themselves, nor do they report this, they do themselves use viability testing. So the notion of not only is this Aspergillus there, but is it viable, that oftentimes will come into question. So that's a thing that we
Hmm.
can look at in terms of whether or not it's there and present. But is that actually meaning that it's an infected batch? Or if there is dead Aspergillus there, that's to me kind of a warning, right? You don't want anything in that
Yeah.
particular batch. And if I
Right.
found it in 1/3 of 1%, then even if it's dead, what inferences can we make? And I think to answer your question, it needs to be looked at. We need to dance with this one for a little bit as a community,
Right.
as a cannabis science community. This needs to be looked at further. Should we fail somebody with one sample that is viable on the potential of it being a random spore? No, we shouldn't fail somebody, in my opinion, based on that small possibility. Should that be allowed to be retested in a format that maybe is designed to detect microbial presence spatially?
Hmm.
Maybe it's broken up into five
Like a
parts and we
second a
test
second trigger for another testing round that's
a
more
hundred
examining
percent.
that area because you are failing, like we're talking about widespread fear for these growers that are literally worried about this 50 pound or whatever crop. It's a
That's a
lot
lot
of
of
money.
money.
And then
Yeah.
they're what? They're out and like, come on, like the state is supposed to support the system for taxes and the
At the same
employees.
time, if let's say we do, let's say if our 1/3 of 1%, let's say it fails,
Right.
and I'm just making this up as I go along, but let's say that triggers the need for a second testing event
Mm-hmm.
where we pull numerous samples and we get a better spatial cross section
Mm-hmm.
and we run numerous microbial tests rather than
Right.
just a single microbial test in a second
Right.
pass. Now, will this tell us, let's say if there's agreement and I pull from 5 different notable sections of the batch and I get 5 hits of Aspergillus? Yeah, it's in there. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, the grower ought to know this type of information too.
Yeah.
And it's a bit more time and money, but wouldn't most cultivators rather do something like
I'd be
this
willing to roll the dice,
than,
know that I got a second shot and I messed up also, and I have to go back to
yeah,
it as well. But
if you
it,
got the right data from this,
right,
and then at least there's some hope of being able to not just say, well, this was a random occurrence.
right.
And now
Well,
that's
the
just me
data shows
spit.
you as the cultivator, like, hey, this is on you. It's not just a one time. And the other thing is most cultivators have good QC checks. They don't get to that point if you really know about this anyway. So that's what makes me wonder if these random hits truly are batch representative. You know what I mean? I don't think it warrants an entire batch destruction. Maybe I am worried about the consumer because I come from being about clean cannabis and a medical consumer. So I understand that someone shouldn't be intaking Aspergillus. But yeah, at what point can we find the levels of action that matter? And I like your approach is a secondary screening that's a lot more volume based to give a better representation. And talking about this, I did want to talk a little bit more in depth about this. Do you think we can kind of break down some of the stuff you're going over? Because I kind of ask a few more detailed questions because I know some of you are probably listening and watching and understanding what is this big ass word, Aspergillus, and it's a fun one to pronounce. But can we kind of dive in a little bit more on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Let us go to.
Because for me as a cultivator, I thought I had an idea of this, but when it gets in the hands of an analytics lab or post processing, a lot of us cultivators don't know what happens or what the triggers are. And talking about going to drying, if I'm responsible for the drying and the trimming, that's one thing. But if I pass it in turkey bags to the packaging entity, they don't store it right, they don't handle it right. That's when all these things can go wrong too. So I feel like there's a lot of
Well, let's break it down. Like, let's kind of talk about where this stuff comes from. So let's go right into it. Like, there is what you've suggested earlier, which is early stage testing. You called it R&D testing.
yeah,
Sometimes referred to as quality control, part of quality assurance programs.
pick a name.
Sometimes simply referred to as pre-compliance testing, right?
Okay.
So no, we know this what it basically is and looks like, but what would you do? You would start with, say, a version of pre-compliance testing or, QA or R&D testing. And from there, you would be able to look at those details for, say, a batch.
Mm-hmm.
Now, depending, and this is something that we brought up in our contamination vectors
Mm-hmm.
episode, which this is somewhat relevant to, how much testing is enough testing? And we came up with a determination there, which is we acknowledge that there is definitely a scale, but you can see a lack of testing is almost a form of cutting corners. And once that bites you in the ass, that's not something you're liable to do again. So, what you end up with is this notion that maybe your quality control testing should be something that is based on what you see internal to the operation.
Mm,
What you'll typically see is maybe multiple quality control tests. I've seen some very big companies for a fairly large batch, batches often in exceeding 50 pounds, but within a couple hundred,
mm-hmm.
and a total of 5 to 6 tests of micro going through all of those. Nothing super overblown compared to considering cost and compared to what the state is requiring
Right.
for that much. But they do want to do their own individual tests. Maybe it'll show up in one sample, maybe it'll show up in all five. And there's all
Mm-hmm.
sorts of inferences you can make about the batch itself and the operation it's coming from based on, again, if you're seeing 5 fails, if it fails across the board, or if it fails just a couple of times, a year from that general space. In my experience, most of the time it tells a story. From
Mm.
being able to study things from this level, I remember working with one operation where the supply chain personnel for that operation actually knew which row from which room he was liable to see fails from
Wow.
based on how much they chopped it up and actually tested. He had what you would call good resolution, information resolution. He would have good resolution of what would actually happen from that point,
Hmm.
so much that it became predictable. There,
That's really interesting
isn't it? It's the Aspergillus is very interesting in terms of what you can ultimately see and trace.
because they were
So
tracking it with diligence,
that is correct.
quality assurance testing, not compliance. So they
100%.
chose this out of their own money to pay for it, to figure it out before shit hit the fan, and they had to test compliance.
That's correct. So what they did is, in terms of testing, if things met a certain level of quality assurance, then it would move over to the testing, followed by levels of packaging and so forth. Reasons too of knowing this is because if it wouldn't show up in a single test, that doesn't mean it won't show up overall or at some point in the future. You have to just be ready for it.
And when you talk about test results, I kind of want to break down a little bit for some people that don't know what test results maybe mean or are. When you get a sample submitted to the lab, you guys are running it through multiple pieces of equipment, and I don't want to get into that right now. But what are you giving back to the client? It's a COA, right? Which I believe is a certificate of analysis, right?
You've got that right, brother.
And
COA stands for Certificate of Analysis, and that is, if you can imagine, when you go to a lab, not just a cannabis testing lab,
any
but
lab typically, right?
blood testing
Yeah,
lab, whatever, they're going to give you they're going to do analyses. They're going to
right.
run these analyses, and they're going to put it on a certificate, and they're going to provide for you a COA. You'll get COAs for essentially anything. I'm sure even like soil that you've
Oh yeah, we
received
do
comes
soil,
with,
water. Yeah, you could do air. Yeah. But for that, but that's basically your visual aid for representing that sample that you
That
can
is, I would call it
use.
your, if you look at your relationship with a lab as a business relationship, of
Hmm.
course, that is the deliverable you get from
Correct.
the lab. It
Because
is the COA.
when you and I had met, it was a long time ago, we were testing for potency back then prior, and then it turned into all these other things. But that was a tool that I had opted for was, hey, with these inputs in my grow method and this strain, can I improve the potency back then? And still is, I guess, to this day. But it's kind of like what you just said as a grower. If you're testing in house on a regular basis for your processes, whether they changed or not, seasonal or not, location it matters. You start seeing like, well, like, hey, like you said, this one row is highly probable for contamination. That being said, this kind of goes into like the one thing as well. If you know it's going to fail or it does fail, are some of these labs you were saying maybe modifying these COAs and results?
That definitely has happened.
Because I know there's some accusations of that, and obviously you guys being in with the lab, you understand these dynamics
I
and
I
nuances,
understand it because I have seen operations where I know that they have systemic difficulties.
and they're running a business. I could see they're trying to make
I've
their
seen
money,
these
but
difficulties prevent them from being able to market everything that comes from them, and
hmm.
I've seen them move to other operations with much greater levels of success.
Hmm.
And I know when this happens that an operation is choosing what we might consider in the business world to just be the path of least resistance.
Hmm.
If, and I think it's even pretty easy to kind of talk oneself into the right state of mind for this to be able to sleep at night, where you're like, well, these other guys were probably just messing up. They were probably just seeing something that wasn't there, and man, F them, because their poor behavior was falling on me, not, hey, these other guys might just be telling me what they want to hear
Sweeping under the
because
rug. Yeah.
it's a much better business plan than telling somebody what they don't want to hear. Because obviously, the last guys who did that aren't,
Right.
aren't in a business relationship anymore. So it's a, I think it's, it's unfortunate because when you look at it through anything but a point of trust in the industry.
Mm.
And you understand that people in all sorts of situations have been given the opportunity to do this path of least resistance type of approach.
Hmm.
You understand that, how much of a moving target things feel like and
Yeah.
how much things get disrupted because of, the consequences of selective enforcement coupled with people who are in a difficult environment to make money and trying to justify virtually anything to themselves.
That's well said.
So yeah, it's that's the outcome of that, which is not pretty. But at least we can, watch it in real time and call it for what it is,
Uh,
right?
yeah, I think it's a little crazy that we came from pre-recreational days when medical was we were self enforcing, right? Regulating ourselves with testing and growing the best that we could. And it was usually single source. You knew the grower weren't far from it, and the feedback and that whole distribution chain mattered. But now it's so decentralized and goes through so many hands that nobody cares about how it was grown and there's no accountability for it. One thing that we've talked about, and you kind of just said, is that the selective enforcement. I like that. It seems going to maybe, again, the levels of concern for infection or contamination is maybe not justified. You're thinking maybe that a little bit of Aspergillus does not represent the entire batch and warrant the destruction or recall of that batch. But we're not sitting here saying that mold should just get a pass either. We're trying to find a level of detection and second ability to see if that was accurate. But we're also seeing that maybe the enforcement is selective and not standardized or equal, especially if they're using a different testing kit that most of the labs, you included, are using.
Well, that's the thing, there's the standardization of science. But we get closer to that question of when do we have an infection versus when do we just have presence? And that's a big deal because we don't really know what the answer to that is. We have an idea that The current answer is unfortunately a poor one because it leads to things like selective enforcement and the feeling of a moving target because of just the nature of what Aspergillus is, and that it can come from seemingly nowhere.
It's everywhere. Yeah.
So it's a definitely a concern in that sense. Now, what what do we do as a community? I think that's something that we can kind of ask each other what we think the issue is and why we're unable to overcome it here. Now, this could be as simple, in my opinion, as a community rising up and really pushing on the DCC to get past things like poorly written laws and selective enforcement. That seems to me to be the best solution to all of this
Mhm.
is really go to the regulators, say, hey, nice try. We're ready for 2.0.
Yeah.
Like, let's approach this, wait on
In a
what
constructive
else
way,
we've
maybe
learned.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, to use it as it has been, which is for the sake of enforcement without actually really acknowledging what the nature of it is as a
Hmm.
microorganism and how it occurs and where it occurs and stuff like that.
Right.
It sucks because it certainly doesn't do very much to help give me a sense of confidence in that our enforcers know what they're doing or are even looking for a route towards public health and safety.
Right.
If anything, it seems like it's almost kind of more useful on an agenda basis. And that's too bad because we're actually trying right here. We're trying to make things better.
Right.
I can't tell you how many operations, unfortunately, have I've run across that are, contaminated
Right.
and how much business I've lost over the years because I just don't tell people what they
Want to
want to
hear.
hear.
Yeah.
That's not
Yeah.
my MO.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
No, I mean, in business, good businesses are built around good ethics, and compliance and, safety, I think are tied together in that, we look at compliance in terms of, OSHA and safety for our employees, testing for the products and how they're cultivated or manufactured. I believe in all that. And that's what you and I have been here for years, promoting and, thinking about this, man. I feel like you and I for over 10 years, not have we just been friends, but have been promoting clean cannabis and pushing the envelope. And here we are, kind of in the hot seat for things like what I thought we were trying to make this, and California, unfortunately, has been a huge opportunity lost. I think that the market has definitely left here, and there's other states that are doing it better. There's other countries, frankly, that are doing it better, and they may have learned from some of the challenges here with regulation
I'm
and
sure they did.
and notably, a lot of people have left here and gone back to their home states or just moved on. And, we're here looking to provide, current events and, transparent education and just discussion. And I think that's what it's always been is I would come to your labs and I remember I'd be dropping off my samples and just chopping it up with you and the PhDs and really digesting what worked and didn't. And that's why we're here today is advocating and sharing all that. And unfortunately, it seems like, yeah, like it's a little bit of interpretation of the law, right? Law enforcement in different
Totally.
degrees can totally look at the what the letter of the law is, and the intent of the law is up to their discretion. And if they feel that you have violated that, which may or may not be adequately true, they can show, and it's true. In this case, I think there's some things that are being highlighted here that are some nuances that could have been just addressed constructively, mutually, and figured out, like you said, a 2.0. And, not to go into another segue, but this is not just about California. This is other states and countries, but other states actually don't differentiate good bacteria, which is aerobic, versus anaerobic, which is bad bacteria. So you can have a organic living soil room, which fails because it has all kinds of bacteria load. So there's different state testing for other bacteria or yeast. The other states have asked me, hey, how do you get around this? Is your genetics clean of this? And I'm like, we're not even testing for that in California. So you talk about lack of standards. Every state, every county has a different dynamic of its own regulatory. So we're just talking about some of the nuances that happens to be with Aspergillus because it is a common denominator probably across the board. But I think that, this is about crop loss. This is a revenue loss for the cultivator. This is tax loss, job loss. You know what I mean? Because some of these companies might not come back and they might shut their doors. And even if it wasn't the cultivator that was ultimately affected, maybe it was the downstream. Because I think as a grower too, is that, well, I did my job, I grew it, I dried it, but what happens if you package it or store it incorrectly? Who's at fault? So tell me about that. Like, at what point do you guys see where the grower is ultimately having to do the testing, but what happens if down the line something else happens?
There are so many little things that can happen to it. I think the nature of being able to create a predictable experience. While I'm at it, do you mind handing me one
Oh,
of
yeah.
those lighters, brother? I think a big part of it is being able to create a predictable, the nature of a predictable experience here. So, early stage testing, mid stage testing, late stage testing, all of which is pre compliance testing in my example here, is going to be able to give you maybe, again, the point that we had brought up in one of our previous episodes is going to bring up the nature or notion of going overblown with your testing program and spending too much time and money on it, which is definitely a real thing.
Diminishing return for sure.
But the nature of something sneaking up on you and screwing with you goes to the floor. So really, we have to figure out, at least from an internal
Yeah,
quality
balance.
control system building standpoint, you figure out what that light touch feels like. You need to know what you're actually dealing with in terms of how much you should be testing, and you end up learning how much you're dealing with in terms of what you should do as wider quality control points. I can give you an example. It's very
Here,
typical
I'll light it
for,
up.
oh, thank you.
You talk, I'll smoke.
Hey, that'll work. Um, it's very typical to see an operation, let's say a particular white label operation who purchases flower from a few different sources for their clients so that their clients can essentially be uh, widening their offerings with some additional flowers or additional flower
Right.
flavors or some additional products in general. And let's say that this white labeler is going out to all of the farms and is saying, "Hey, I want to purchase your product." The first type of test that they might run with these farms will be what we call full panel. Full panel testing is basically everything, which will include all of the things that you'll most frequently see fails for. If we're talking about flower, it would be pesticide, micro, and heavy metals, more or less in that order. You would want to test for all of those things. Now, let's say you test for all those things, it all comes back clean, and there's a level of trust being considered with working with that operation. Now, if there's a level of trust being considered, what are we able to say? Well, they don't use pesticides, right? They don't use a grow medium or any newts or means of feeding the plants, which contain heavy metals. So those are pretty permanent things if you think about it in a
It's
operation, or
not going to
bare minimum
change. Yeah.
semi-permanent. They're probably not changing how they're going to be growing,
Right.
and they're probably not going to be changing their pesticide program up either. You can speak pretty straightforwardly to this, but if they have control over their environment, they're not spraying anything in the first place.
Right.
Probably not going to start anytime soon, right? Probably.
No, I have a safe assumption there.
So the only thing that going forward from there that you're going to find yourself testing frequently are those things that will vary from batch to batch. Heavy metals and pesticides not really being much of them, but micro, yeah, micro random
Right.
spores, right?
Hmm.
Micro is one that you see people testing every single batch, and also potency.
So on that, it kind of ties into a grower's worst nightmare is your invisible enemies, right? We in past I've talked about plant pathogens and diseases. Some do experience, you see it when the plant is growing, but it may or may not be harmful to the consumer. So this is not a reason why it tests on a full panel, but things like the moles, E. coli, and other contamination, are concerning for public health, which I get. So at that point, you guys are, a testing agency are looking out for public health and safety, but the growers are really concerned about a crop that's sellable, right? And so I'm trying to see where, the growers are very concerned about, Aspergillus being a real problem, but how do they, I guess, mitigate it if it is something that's showing up down the line? And like some may not even know it until they end up doing a compliance test. And then that's what triggers them to do QA tests, is what you're saying, to
Oftentimes,
prevent.
so sometimes they're wholesaling it to somebody, and the person they're wholesaling it to
Does
will
the
say
testing,
that,
right?
yep.
Yeah.
So this actually goes back to partially, we went on a pretty healthy tangent there, but this partially answers a chunk of the question that you asked me a little bit earlier. What is the grower ultimately responsible for? I can't quite remember how you worded it, but in terms of keeping
Yeah, he
their
passes it on, it
operation.
passed, but then who's
So,
responsible
yeah, at
after?
what point happened? So, control has been kind of the underlying aspect of the answer that I started to give you right there. And that's something that a thread that we've so far discussed. And to continue with that, what does it basically mean to make something, as I called predictable earlier? What does it take to maintain that level of control? Now, I suggested that you'd be able to do levels of testing as a buyer for cannabis. I think that that does a pretty good job of being able to reflect what level of control and predictability somebody would put into an operation. It's good to note that Aspergillus could come from anywhere. It's good to note that certain rooms can end up with certain issues
Mm,
depending on what kind of water damage, for
mhm.
instance, could
Environment.
be lurking in the walls or right, in proximity to the particular row or where
Right.
the origin for the problem ended up happening. So, how can you keep an eye on that? And the answer is frequent and multiple testing is the way to go. There's also little bits where we would suggest that you don't necessarily have to run a full panel test worth millions, worth hundreds and
Sure hope
hundreds.
not.
I got, yeah, zeros on
Crop
the
is worth
mind there.
millions, but the testing is nah.
No, well said. I guess I could spin to an idea of the operation itself being, at risk,
Right.
which often does come with a lot of zeros. And in that sense, these things are absolutely related as a helpful, as a sort of helpful segue right there
Right.
to be able to say that, if you are running into this issue that is affecting, say, a part of your operation, what is the widespread implication of that and how might that translate to being a very expensive thing that you need to eradicate? That is a real risk. What we end up seeing if there are a series of fails, if there is something pointing to a systemic issue with that facility, what is going to be the next step? What would you end up being? What would you end up doing if you were failing Aspergillus batch after batch versus being able to keep a lid on it? And I think that you would adjust. You would keep, testing spatially in an operation. You'd probably test multiple times per room per cycle just to make sure there's no issues in there, as well as in the trim area, in dry rooms. I'm
Yeah.
going not going in order, as well as I should say in dry rooms, in trim and packaging areas,
Right.
so that you can make sure that there's nothing in the shared facilities that's actually going to bite you in the ass.
And part of that is that you bring up, looking at these different areas and the grow. And, it reminds me in previous years working with you is I came from commercial HVAC and I was used to working on laboratories and rooms with positive air pressure, HEPA filters, and a lot of other environmental controls that people maybe weren't, familiar with. And during my time of learning to grow, environmental control was everything. And think about it, in a grow room and even in a greenhouse, they're contained air systems. If you have HVAC, dehumidifiers, or any kind of fan, it's moving the air. The parts of that machine are going to be potentially contaminated with those spores, right? If you're not cleaning them or treating it and monitoring it, that's going to contaminate it. Things like leaks, not cleaning your equipment properly, your staff coming and going. There's a lot of things that I could bring up easily that I could see continue to create that real risk and the contamination. And for me, testing, I guess if I were to troubleshoot this with you, because I'm going to start backwards, is, oh, my weed failed. I need to figure out at what point did it fail, right? Oh, this died. That's all you, bro. So if it did fail for Aspergillus in my flower, I'm going to go to you, Nate, at the lab and say, okay, can we go to my facility and take a look? Where is this starting? Let's start with our media, like what we're growing in. Let's start with our water, maybe scrub the tables or the wall, my HVAC and fans, the things that are mixing with the air, right?
I also interview the people at the facility to see if they know of any places where water damage has happened or could be happening.
Interesting. Okay.
Because, oftentimes if there's a wet spot that suddenly turned into a moldy smelling wet spot, and I want to know
Hmm.
about that. I also can't tell you how many times I've actually found the problem by walking through a facility, and I smell that spot, and I kind of, politely stop the tour and say, okay, I need to look around here for a minute.
Right.
Maybe it's something people are nose blind, if that's even a real term. I heard on a
I feel
commercial
like there's a
once.
lot of
Maybe it's
things going
something
on in a
people are
facility.
that
People,
too, but
yeah,
yeah.
they're just like, I don't have time to identify every little challenge, and I guess that's what I was going to say is that as a grower, you have a million things going on, and anybody in this industry is just go, go, go. But having another set of eyes and someone that's more focused around like your, process and being able to go through and say, okay, let's start here. And, things like swabbing or doing the culture dish. She's talking about petri dish. If you guys were actually able to come through and collect the samples and be able to help identify what we're looking at and the levels of contamination, and then we can work backwards and reduce those vectors of contamination. That's what we do for everything from plant disease to the pests, all those levels of contamination. And they usually do start with the crossover rooms where things are like hallways or the dry rooms or, trimming, the places where you end up putting all the product through like a bottleneck or a funnel, if you will.
Yep. The shared infrastructural areas are what I typically go looking for. You're not always going to be able to locate the primary source of the contamination there,
Okay.
but you can find the effects of it pretty straightforwardly. From there as well, if you are able to locate a part of the pathway through which contamination is getting around and ultimately
Right.
contaminating products, you're also able to start tracking it backwards. Now that, so to speak, you know what to look
Right.
for. Example: one time, I found a secondary point of contamination inside of a dehumidifier, specifically the filter on it, and it was basically a petri dish attached to a fan. This was hanging over the trim area of a certain operation and helping to contaminate everything in that trim
Batch
area.
after batch. Yeah.
Once I had located this, I was able to look at other places that were within proximity of this. And what I found was an open drain pipe, maybe about 15 linear feet or so.
Hmm.
The dehumidifier was hanging from the ceiling. This was across a corridor, but only it was line of sight. It was only about 15 feet away,
Uh,
and it was an open drain pipe. And I swabbed the drain pipe, and I also found Aspergillus
hmm.
in there, same strain. And I was able to pretty quickly infer that the open drain pipe at one point got the contamination that would have been that would have been ready to really screw up anybody or any place's day from the point in which it gets spread,
Right.
was able to essentially jump spread. I mean, it got sucked into a dehumidifier, which
Hmm.
by definition is a pretty massive intake fan right there, and it got sucked
It
up
removes
and
the moisture, but not the pathogens or mold or, yeah.
100%. Yeah, it doesn't sterilize
It's
anything.
not a HEPA.
But what it did do was it was able to intake in and this airborne mold, and it was able to give it a home. And then from where it touched down, it was able to broadcast that mold across an entire operation,
Yep.
multi-million dollar operations worth of flour coming out of it, that no matter where the flour was coming out of in the facility, as soon as it entered the dry
Yep.
room, it had no chance. And
No, nobody's seen
and
that.
even in
Yeah.
what we found in the dry room was a secondary source of contamination from a primary source. So ended up in Aspergillus, there it is being opportunistic, there
Yeah.
it is being everywhere,
Yeah.
and there it is seeing a pretty direct pathway to be able to kind of fester and broadcast itself over a pretty wide space.
And then when you do this testing, I know we talked about there's two different methods, but we talked about a qPCR and then plating and doing like cultures or like a petri dish.
Yeah, I've done now the PCR approach is something that happens regardless,
Okay.
whether we're taking a sample from the harvest itself through testing or an early pre-compliance sample, or if we are taking I'm trying to think of other things that we might have. Let's say I'm taking a swab. Let's say I'm taking a plate sample.
Hmm.
In all of those cases, we're going to be putting it through the PCR, through the qPCR to be able to tell us whether or not we have a match to that species of mold.
Got it.
So we have a pretty good idea of what we're looking at because we're able to genetically match it through the PCR. Now, again, if that's not used properly, though, that's just really a very Boolean thing.
Hmm.
But let's say I'm going through a whole operation and taking, plate samples, essentially petri dish
Hmm.
samples, and from the environment and or swab samples, and I'm going across a whole operation and doing that and just grabbing what I can
Right.
detect. Now I actually have it between the areas that there are hits versus not hits. I actually can see where stuff is coming from. Remember me mentioning earlier that
Mm,
I don't often see this kind of stuff,
right.
pop up in grow areas and
Right.
veg areas. I know that because of numerous types of scans of those areas, but where I do find them is in the other areas where maybe there isn't such bright light and
Mm,
maybe there isn't so much air circulating through things like HEPA filters and stuff like that. But in areas of shared infrastructure, not only is it more prevalent in those areas, so
mhm.
there's a better chance of it showing up and me seeing it, but also at the same time, there are the opportunities for cross contamination and for it to turn from, what may have been a smaller problem wherever it was picked up into a much larger
Right.
problem.
Right.
And the nature of that, will differ from, case by case.
And I feel like a lot of that gets overlooked because people are not thinking about that down the line contamination point. And you brought up a couple things was filters, and the humidity. These tie into the environment, which a lot of people may or may not change their filters, in their home or their car and things like that. But they know that they should. And some of this is a lot with the cultivation or manufacturing facility. And I'd like to point out that a lot of the laboratories, if you're an analytical lab or a tissue culture lab, they operate in an aseptic environment, which means everything has to be clean, HEPA filtered, usually positive air pressure, and certain other processes dress out, right? That makes sure that you're not bringing in the contamination and spreading it.
That's right.
And I feel like that could be notably used in these cultivation facilities a little bit is just going through these checks and balances. Talking about that, I come from commercial HVAC, so I'm very familiar with a lot of UV treatment, ozone treatment, not just HEPA filters and such. But, in this, do you think that some of this prevention in the facility and design is really just prevention and consideration, or is it an afterthought, or what do you think?
I think it does a lot, like what I was mentioning in the last statement. Generally speaking, where the most attention is on air cleaning and circulation is generally where I find the fewest number of the lowest presence of Aspergillus,
Really
which is the grow rooms. I find it all the time in the hallways. I find it all the
interesting.
times in trim areas.
So the low light, wet environments, because the dry air moving is less likely to harbor in those environments, but a wet, soggy filter from a dehumidifier.
100%.
That's
It can be forgotten much more easily. There's a lot bigger of a load going through there with regards to it being in areas of
right.
shared infrastructure.
Hmm.
Shared infrastructure in this case, including drain pipes, right?
No, that's very, very
Just the
true. Yeah.
just the load of microbial activity that came from the drain pipe was, and it ceased after
Yeah.
the drain pipe was appropriately closed up in the sense of where it was
Hmm.
open and didn't need to be, right?
Right.
This was able to be everything was staved off once we figured that out. So this was a very successful example that I had given from
Right.
before. In any instances where you end up finding these kind of things, you need to look at the pathway through which it came. And unfortunately, it's the moldy slice of bread.
Mm. Yeah.
When you find the moldy slices of bread, you didn't find it at the stage often when there was just one moldy slice of
Right.
bread in the whole bread factory. You found it when a good chunk of what was coming out was moldy, which means there's a larger problem now. Now, in that sense, we could say early testing saves the day. And as mentioned, there's a balance between not testing too much
Mm.
and what you can ultimately do. So I actually want to turn this back to you on you as the cultivator. I would want to ask you because I think and feel that most cultivation techniques that are mainstream in terms of airflow, lighting, and other things,
Right.
levels of wetness, the facility itself is at risk oftentimes,
Hmm.
but the grow rooms themselves don't appear to be easy points, although Aspergillus could be there,
Right.
although it could jump on the plants and take a ride and flourish at another part in the process. It doesn't seem to be like it's touching down and flourishing
Hmm.
much from the grow rooms themselves, based on what I've seen. I have seen it, and oftentimes it comes from water damage when it does. But generally speaking, when we have something that could be considered contamination in the grow rooms, it doesn't present itself nearly as often as it would in other parts of the facility. So, as a grower, I ask you, knowing what best practices are to stay away from these things,
Right.
what kind of things would you do in order to keep the potential boogeyman away in this sense?
It's a good question. I do want to start off with asking how much is the test for that R&D to see what Aspergillus even if I have it.
It's usually in the low $100 range. Think like for most labs will be around 125 to 150-ish. Could be a bit higher.
Well, let's call it 150. That's easier to multiply out. But if it's 150 and that's just for that panel, is it just for Aspergillus alone? Or am I getting anything else out of that?
No, you get like that's so reflecting on, what my lab would charge would be 125 for a sample that would give you let me think, you would get all four species of Aspergillus that the state would look for plus bacteria, Salmonella and E. coli.
Which are pretty important to me because I don't want that out there. So if I was to mathematically look at that and go, okay, if that's 150 to clear my plants of this at different areas, I would budget in and think to myself, well, what is my end crop worth? And if there's a chance that any of it could get recalled and destroyed, how much of an insurance policy am I willing to pay? And I think everybody has a little bit of a different tolerance, right, for your risk of your house or your vehicle and whatever insurance premiums you were willing to pay and deductibles. And I think that's kind of this equation is that the ROI, right, is if I'm going to spend, let's just say, $5,000 a month in testing between QA and compliance, but my crop is worth $1 million, it's probably justifiable. Now, I'm not saying that those numbers are accurate, but if I were to quantify it, I would be finding a relative relationship with my QA testing to see in my own grows and processes where are these things popping up. And if I'm not seeing it, or if I am, I would be in a hurry continuing to test to eradicate those positives or those fails, and then be sure that I spent the money up front to mitigate the loss on the back end. I would still test and continue to screen for Aspergillus, but I would do it less if I wasn't having triggers pop up. So you mentioned if a grow had a third or a quarter of these popping up all over the place, that warrants a very serious reset or look at what could be responsible. But if I'm having 1 out of 100 pop up on my own R&D test, I'm still going to consider it, but it may not be as compounding of a problem. So to your point, does it make sense for me to keep spending $125 times 100 every month? Maybe not. I have to look at the cost. But I am concerned with the fact that I could have an inspection or a test done from the regulatory agency that could entirely wipe out that crop. And I'm not worried about just that one 50-pound batch. What if it's multiple? Because I would assume that my processes are the same across the board. So does that mean that multiple of my batches could fail?
It means that you want to keep a look at the entire facility as best as possible. And you want to keep a level of resolution, understanding, in terms of what you have going on there in this conversation microbiologically.
Hmm.
In other conversations, you want to keep this, an eye on things chemically speaking. What if the space that you're building into was, you're not the first occupant of that building, and what if pesticides were used in that space? I mean, hell, somebody spraying, some raid going after roaches
Yeah.
3 years ago could absolutely ruin your day, but in ways that you couldn't possibly imagine. So when it comes to something that can even grow from, the result of being in a wet space in something like a grow area, which is a perpetually wet space, right?
Yeah.
What are we actually like left with? And you have to consider, and it's kind of the same idea that we've mentioned in a few different ways. You have to monitor everything, right? You have to be able to watch what's floating around, so to speak. You need to do that in a way that allows things to be predictable, but also is sustainable. And this might mean that, aside from the level of batch testing, maybe you're doing levels of room testing. This may mean that you are hiring somebody like me or a root cause analysis expert, where you would have somebody like me come in at the beginning of an operation, or even as you're thinking about purchasing the building and all of that fun stuff, right down to the notion of as you build things out, or as you think you've seen water damage, or as the building continues to age, or depending on what the type of build out you used, if there is any wood involved in the structure versus a non wooden, all metal built out kind of format. What does this mean? How is it going to be put together? And what level of concerns do you have? To you, I would even say then, what build out choices as well as consumable grow media choices you could use in order to help stave off these possibilities. Obviously, everything DPS panels or metal or fiberglass and not wood. That's a pretty straightforward one.
Yeah.
There's even going to be certain types of grow media to which you have to be concerned about that much more so, and not just in the grow rooms too. Sometimes that grow media is just sitting in the warehouse and it's got, things like Aspergillus on it, and it's just festering and
Yeah.
broadcasting and ready to ruin your day, if not today or tomorrow. And after this set of spores settles down and starts to grow in its own special areas, it's a
Yeah.
perpetually wet operation that's always going to see issues. So, to you as a cultivator, in terms of things like monitoring and then controlling, what would you have to add?
You hit it on the head too. There's a few different inputs that over time, even in our contamination, vectors episode is discussing, where do these contamination points start? And a lot of it does with the media of choice. If you're using cocoa or a soilless mix or soil, they may already be containing a lot of these issues. And it's not just Aspergillus. Sometimes it comes with bugs themselves, and then other hidden things like Fusarium and Pythium, which are root rot fungi that attack the plants. And this is not just specific to cannabis either. Similarly, you basically could be looking at alternatives like rock wool, which is a hydroponic media, or just water, but both of those are still susceptible to their own essential contamination points, especially if you're bringing in the problem or it exists in the room and it's settling there. A lot of this too is going back to the environment, is keeping it clean, maintaining the equipment, in the right environment, something like less than 60% humidity, and also talking about genetics. Given what I do as a genetics consultant, it's been primarily chased for THC yield and terpene production. But a lot of growers, especially that do sun grown, will ask for things that are like powdery mildew resistance or pest resistance. In this situation, there might be some genetics that are a little bit more Aspergillus resistant. We just don't necessarily have the data and the understanding of that, but that could be something down the line that is a potential for diving more into, right? In this situation, there's definitely going to be a lot more cultivation tactics that could be employed that we could reduce the bio load of the room, which is the density of plant nugs. This kind of goes against the increase the yield model, but if you increase the yield and it just fails, does it matter at that point? And a lot of these guys are growing smaller buds now rather than bigger buds to avoid things like botrytis, powdery mildew during the grow, but this could lead to the aspergillus, which may or may not be found while it's alive and growing the plant. But once you harvest it and dry it, and now it's no longer circulating, it's no longer alive, it could still become a decaying product in the wrong environment. So the dry room should definitely be clean and in the right environment, under 60%. And too dry is also not correct either, because we talked a little bit earlier about testing, but one things you do test for is water activity. So essentially the moisture level, right? Can you tell me a little bit about what moisture level does to affect the buds, I guess, when it's harvested? What does that translate to?
No problem. So, water activity is essentially the measurement of unbound water. If it's bound with another chemical and less available as food for microbial life or to self
Mm,
sustain, rather, microbial life, it's considered to add to the water activity measurement if it's unbound. That's part of how the state does things. Remember me mentioning that there's only so many microorganisms. There's six of them: E. coli, Salmonella, Aspergillus terris, Aspergillus niger, Aspergillus flavus, and Aspergillus fumigatus.
oh, wow.
Those are the six that
Fancy.
are on the. Those are the six that are on the California panel. Now, those guys are not the only bits of microbial life that can attach to and be present on cannabis. And so, what does the state do to help us assume that there's things like maybe yeast, for instance, which could contaminate cannabis, but even though it might be on cannabis, we can't have the same type of test, of course, that exists for any of those very harmful organisms. Being that I just mentioned,
Right.
because the likelihood that yeast will be on cannabis is extremely high. We just need to make sure that there's not going to be so much on there that can potentially become a real, infection, a real concern there. So they have us do water activity, which is to say that the yeast would be able to nourish itself on that unbound
Mm,
water. And the water activity reading will be able to demonstrate how dry something is and how unavailable as a point of sustenance it would be for microbial life. So rather than testing yeast, we basically make sure that there's not enough water for it to survive and grow and stuff like that. And that is what water activity is. So if you can think about all of the other, bits of, microbial life, bacteria, yeast,
right.
mold alike, that could potentially contaminate things, the state at this point assumes only the very worst of organisms would belong on the microbial panel. But that anything else, we just make sure that there's not enough juiciness, if you will, not enough water
Mhm.
within the product itself for it to be able to take hold and really grow and become a problem. So that's why, if generally seeming like you don't get too much cannabis these days that, smells like ammonia, but that used to happen every so often, that's the reason, is because the water activity, when it was fairly high was able
Right.
to be a home for bacteria with a higher water activity. And bacteria, one of the things it's going to metabolize, the output is going to be the ammonia, and that's what you would have smelled. So, what means no bacteria is able to grow in
Mm,
it when the water activity is low enough and it's dry enough. So that gives you a little bit of an idea there. Also, something to mention when you mentioned genetics before, just a quick add on to that. I actually have done for major operations a test of all of their products in even areas known to be stricken with Aspergillus.
mm,
And I can tell you that I was absolutely fucking lootly able to isolate which strains were more prone to versus more
mm.
resistant to Aspergillus just within an operation.
That's good to know.
I can tell you that there are certain strains out there where, like the more OG, core OG like,
Hmm.
the more they seem to be resistant. And I can tell you that for the dessert category ones, the more dessert-y and inbred they seem to be, the less resistant they seem to be. So very interesting in terms of studying that. We can go into that a bit later, but I actually was absolutely able to get information about which strains for an operation were resistant versus non-resistant, and genetics absolutely had the opportunity to play a role. In my opinion, on a wide scale, you would even be able to take and select certain genetics. Let's say if you did have a problem operation, which there was a somewhat uncontrollable level of Aspergillus going on there, it occurred to me that you could stick to more resistant strains in those parts of the building or in that particular
Hmm.
operation. And if there are other operations that you can work through or partner with to grow your less resistant stuff, but as a means of still being able to have it and not throw out as much of it, there seems to be the notion that there
Hmm.
can be more segmentation and opportunities for being able to sort out what types of selections you can make for what you can grow and where. Again, based completely on genetic selection and mold resistance with a particular genetic.
Oh, excuse me. And going back to part of that is looking at, genetic, I was thinking that's something that we should be testing more for because what happens in the genetic space is that, in the nurseries, we're providing the genetics with as much data as we can on most the key production information, right? That they want to see is going to be yield, THC, and flavor, maybe color, right? But the resistance to pests and disease is kind of becoming more and more prominent as these big operations count the percentage of canopy loss. And I think that that's something that we might want to look into, But for me to send it out to a lab, for quality assurance or R&D, I mean, is there a way I can offset it and maybe do it a little bit cheaper, like in-house, maybe, I don't know if I mean, you could train somebody to run a PCR on, in-house. You could do plates maybe if you had the right kit.
Be pretty expensive.
So it's not really
Sensible
viable.
things the most sensible things you could do would be to train yourself in terms of running total yeast and mold counts, which you'd be able to do with those settle plates,
Okay.
where you're able to essentially collect samples of the environment and find out if it's a pro mold environment or not.
Right.
And because of how prevalent it is, and to some of the original points we made earlier, I mean, it's everywhere. If it's not in your right hand, it's in your left
Hmm.
hand kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um, to make that point, it's less of a question of, somebody actually, you know what, you once upon a time had somebody who you hired for a project, and I remember he was making a point about pests in general.
Hmm.
And his whole point was outcompete, don't eradicate.
Mm.
And I feel like that's a good point. You can probably, in fairly effective ways, if you were trying to do something in house, if you were able to utilize and get a consistent understanding of total yeast and mold counts, you may be able to look at the overall state of microbiological activity in the space and determine what baselines you have, what
Mm.
threshold you need to work within in order to have it all work out just fine. So that might be something you'd be able to determine, although not without some potential trial and error there, if that makes any sense.
No, it does. And with everything, running, lab tests for me, I've always outsourced with a reliable lab. It's not my strong suit, but it is something that I've used as a tool, not just for compliance with the facilities that we have to, but just in-house, QA, as you've talked about. What are the options if I know it's going to fail, or if and when it does fail? Is there such things as remediation? Can I fix it, or do I have to destroy it?
Always can remediate it, and it's to the listeners out there, a fancy word for clean it up. So always have the opportunity to remediate it, and that comes with some concern. I think the most frequent concern I hear is that it might not be worth the same amount after you go through the equivalent of remediation.
Right.
Remediation oftentimes will indicate that you're going to irradiate or microwave. Sometimes ozone expose the batch in an effort to try to, if not remove the DNA from the microbial life, at the very least render it non-viable.
Yeah.
So that would be the ways that you see sort of attempted there. Nobody's really stoked. Excuse me.
Yeah, to do a remediation, that's not what I want to think about.
Exactly.
Like it's already
Nobody's really
past what I
stoked
was
at the
hoping.
idea of
Yeah,
a version of frying your weed
yeah, because that's
in order
secondary.
to clean it
Yeah,
up. So the main concern I hear is it won't be worth the same.
I already know one of the challenges that we've had because we have operators that do end up going into remediation phase is that they end up having to choose two things: is that if you fail for Aspergillus or another contamination, you're either going to end up destroying the batch and losing the entire revenue from that. Or you can alternatively do what he was talking about, which is some sort of remediation. Remediation going through whatever costs it takes to get it remediated, but then the downside is that product is not going to be as valuable. So theoretically, whoever your buyer is going to be is probably going to do something along the lines of extraction, maybe something where they're going to take the material that you have, which is not as visibly ideal, probably doesn't smell as good, and who knows what happened to the potency. So when you have lack of potency, lack of terpenes, that product is going to be devalued, but you might get back maybe your costs of production, and do something like a distillate extraction or something further for edibles. I'm not sure what you could do with a remediated product.
So the concern, of course, being that it doesn't have the same value. The next, outside of being able to, let's say we're still talking about flour, the best next approach to be able to remediate something, at least in the microbial sense, is the idea of being able to extract from it. Now, I think this still comes with its concerns. What you end up extracting, the yield of that, is never going to be the same as the yield from your starting product, from your
Right.
biomass, right? So that's one of the big concerns. The other is that it's just not going to sell as well, or that it might not have the same means for selling through a particular company. If a
Right.
certain company is known as a flower company, it might not be easy for them to sell an extracted version of one of their products.
Right.
Might need to work with another product or another line, or maybe it takes the form of a potential collaboration. In any of these cases, you end up seeing another solution towards remediation. Then other solutions end up carrying with it possibly a drop in value, possibly a element of difficulty for being able to sell it through. But, if the question comes in, do you have an option of being able to extract it so that you don't have to destroy it? The answer, generally speaking, is yes. Of course, extracted products come with their own host of concerns and all of that fun stuff to come along with. Now, residual solvents is added to the panel of things you need to pass, where that wasn't something you ever needed to worry about in
True.
flour.
Yeah.
But that in itself definitely is an outlet and something people have done before. So you can remediate through extraction. You can potentially destroy. And the only other unfortunate side of the destruction side is I've seen all too many samples that were, air quotes, destroyed, being instead diverted. And that's, I think, a concern that comes up on the metric and transfer side of things and all of that, because you definitely don't want to see stuff diverted. But if, in the path of least resistance nature of how this industry sometimes operates, you might end up seeing these issues. It's unfortunate because, again, the regulators, this is something they're very aware of and, choose to look away from in light of running other enforcement actions. And it's interesting seeing everything play out. And I think we'll see, possibly some sanity restored to the situations that are dealing with those soon enough. And hopefully things like Aspergillus, something that we can research further, wrap our heads around better,
Right.
understand from a more practical standpoint versus how I think it's been approached so far, which is it's just this boogeyman that seems to be right around the corner. I mean, brother, you're a cultivator and you
Right.
consult cultivation operations. I mean, it's a boogeyman, right? It could happen at any time to anybody. And once it's found, it may never go away, right?
Yeah, it becomes a real problem. And like you said, it becomes one thing for the cultivators in the back of their mind. My clients, they're thinking to themselves, well, hold on here. Like, what am I going to do to regain any of this? Because I may not be able to afford to come back after this. And so your comment of diversion is exactly one of the issues there with the nuances of regulatory and inconsistent standards. And a lot of people that maybe don't purchase from a dispensary for lab tested clean product are potentially picking up product that may or may not have contamination because it's not
Yeah.
been screened, and it's a high probability of the stuff that's being passed
All that
around.
all that THCA product, all that hemp product is not regulated
Right.
in the same sense. And is it possible for somebody in not just California, anywhere, to know their product could potentially have aspergillus and to instead label it as hemp and then to ship it out the door and
Right.
for it to be purchased through a hemp dispensary or as THCA product, which, carries with it basically all the same thing that cannabis is supposed to,
Right.
except a lack of regulations and a lack of being able to underline these issues when they do happen. And that's, of course, what we're trying to avoid here. And that was by participating in regulated industry. That was
Right.
always the goal, to try to avoid that.
Yeah, it's kind of discouraging some of the growers, in certain situations, I'm sure. And I think that there's still a lot to be learned in terms of what is necessary for protecting, the consumer, which we're all for. And I think what we have been for a long time, over a decade here, we're consumers and we care about it. And, looking back, I think we all jokingly know we were consuming not so good cannabis 10, 20 years ago and before then. But a lot has come from that. And I think it's just a proactive approach that we need to use science and good horticulture practices and take notes from the lab. And, one thing, as we wrap up here, that I think on the future that's going to come around is probably GMP, good manufacturing practices for these cultivation facilities, labs that are doing manufacturing that lean on what you're doing, which is ISO accredited for an analytic lab. But what the manufacturing and cultivation companies don't do is have similar standards. So nobody's checking if their environmental monitors and controls are accurate. Are their tools clean? Are their staff trained? Are they changed out? Are the filters changed? A lot of these facilities I go in and consult for, I'm going through a basic discovery of that's not done. You should do all that before you even bother optimizing this place because you're spending all this money on this extra shit that doesn't matter because you're fundamentally flawed. And that's a
Yep.
really sad thing. And that is going to be the detriment to a lot of these operators, big and small, is if you don't analyze your basic process flows and get tripped up. And that's part of it, is going to be, does it make sense from a profit standpoint, and testing for issues that could trip you up either in quality or a test.
Yep. That pretty much wraps it. There's a big question, a big wonder of how, the community as a whole is going to respond to all of this. I'm looking forward to seeing what some of these next steps are, if the government enforcers, are going to be compatible versus enforcing
Right.
with these next few steps as well. And of course, Boomer and I will be there to help inform and educate and let everybody know what to kind of expect. Please let us know what you think. And stoked that you checked us out on these episodes. And thank you so much for following up and, joining us on this topic. Yeah, this has been huge. And thank you so much for joining me, Boomer. I think we're going to be talking about Aspergillus a lot more in the future.
Yeah, I think as things change here, it'll definitely be a good topic to revisit as well as other things in the regulatory component of testing as well.
Awesome. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Boomer, thank you so much.
Thank you guys.
All right. It's a wrap.
Take care.